Hello and welcome to today's webinar, How Best to Gain Grant Funding for Your Business. Thank you for joining this session today. We aim to give you a realistic view on this type of funding, how to improve your chances of successfully securing a grant, and a brief overview on the Jerome's Grant Service. Before we start, I have a few housekeeping items to cover. First, we'd love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have a question for our speakers, please feel free to send it through to the Q&A tab at the top right of your screen. This can be submitted anonymously if you would prefer to do so. We'll be answering questions at the end of the session, but if we don't get your question during today's webinar, we'll be sure to follow up afterwards. Also, just to let you know, today's webinar will be available on the Jerome's website after the live session. So I'd like to kick things off by welcoming Paul Heaven from Jerome's Corporate Finance. Paul, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for attending this morning's webinar. We ran a webinar for the staff at Jerome's yesterday and we encountered a couple of technical issues. I'm hoping we can navigate through this morning's without those occurring again, but should they occur and the screen freezes for any reason, my colleagues Sharon and Ross will pick up the dialogue and I'll jump back in as quickly as I can. We also had a few sound issues yesterday, so if anybody's experiencing any difficulty in hearing me, if you could flag that up to Sharon through the message board, then we'll try and address the problem if at all possible. Anyway, again, good morning to everybody and welcome. I'm Paul Heaven. I'm the director of Jerome's Corporate Finance, and we're the part of the Jerome's team that deals with owner-managers who are looking to buy, sell or raise finance for their business. And obviously one component of that kind of fundraising potentially is grant funding. And today is, I think, the fourth or the fifth in our webinar series on different aspects of what we do, and we're going to cover off grants. So we're going to specifically cover off the issue of, what is grant funding? Is it the best option for my business? How do we increase hopefully your chances of securing a grant? And then we'll touch off at the end of a new Jerome's grant service that we're launching effective as of today. So without further ado, let's get into the body of the webinar. So is grant funding the best option for my business? Well, grants are a restricted type of funding. So generally speaking, they are limited to a particular type of activity or a different type of expenditure. So the project that you have in mind may or may not be ideally suited for grant funding, and we'll come on to that a bit more during the course of the webinar. I've also covered off here what I've referred to as the vagaries of relative merit, and I think that's best explained by way of an example really. We actually ran a grant scheme for Stoke and Staff's council a few years back now, where there was some money available to distribute out by way of grant to a series of small and micro enterprises in the Stoke and Staffs area. Now, the amount of grant funding that was available for that particular scheme, if memory serves me, wasn't huge. It was about £1.5 million. And during the series of calls, and we made 3 calls on that grant, I think we generated applications that exceeded something like £6 million. And what that basically means is that we've got £1.5 million to distribute to applicants who've collectively requested £6 million. It won't be a surprise, therefore, to people who are on this webinar to hear that we needed to scale those applications back. And what that basically meant is that applicants that met the criteria of the grant scheme and their projects potentially met the criteria of the grant scheme, some of those were not going to be successful, and we had to judge the applications according to their relative merit. And this is a frustrating dimension of grant schemes. You may feel as though your application perfectly meets, and indeed it may well perfectly meet the requirements of the grant scheme, but there is a limited amount of money and you need to be aware that you're being judged against others. Now, in the case of that particular scheme, the number of jobs being created was a key driver. So you might have put in a grant application and you were going to create, 3 or 4 jobs. Somebody else might have put in a grant application, they were going to create 10 or 12. And because on a relative merit score, they scored higher, they were more likely to achieve the grant than others. So just be mindful of the fact that even if you do meet all of the requirements of the scheme, it still may be the case that you don't secure the grant, because it's not like, debt or equity funding. You can't assume there's a kind of limitless amount of money available. Another thing to bear in mind, and it's something I'll come back to, is that relatively few grants cover 100% of the cost. They deal in a world that is known as intervention rates. Now these are in turn driven by state aid requirements, and obviously we're still in that kind of transition phase from the world of the EU over to the world that awaits us post-Brexit. Now, in the world of the EU, the state aid rules dictate that depending on I suppose you class it as being the wealth and employment and general economic prosperity of a particular region, determine the intervention rate. How much the state can put in as a percentage of the overall project cost. There was a good general rule: intervention rates rarely go higher than 50%. So if you have a project and it's going to cost, I don't know, £50,000, even if there is a grant available, it's quite likely that the grant would not exceed 50% contribution of the cost towards that project, and in some areas even less. That said, the intervention rate will be clear on the grant scheme itself and the details of it, so you'll be pre-warned as to what that's kind of looking like. Right, so depending on the size of the grant, you may also have to provide a budget. The criterion that determines what the application looks like will be set out in the grant itself, but certainly for a more sizable grant contribution, I would suggest that anything over £50,000 or possibly even over 25,000, there'll be a requirement to provide a budget for the project as part of your application. So you'll need to be mindful of the skill or the need to be able to produce such a budget. Many grants call upon what are known as the value for money principles. And again, these vary a little in terms of how they get implemented, but quite commonly they take the form of a requirement for there to be more than one quotation for each of the key cost components that are in the budget. And it's not uncommon for there need to be a requirement for 3 quotations. So again, you need to be mindful of that. You need to make sure that you've secured multiple quotes and that you're in a position to be able to meet that grant criterion requirement. So if you have one particular supplier in mind, a grant may not be suitable for the project you have. Grants are subsidies. They're issued to support businesses, and there'll be some requirement to evidence that you need the grant. I'll come on to a kind of irony in all that in a moment, but there is a requirement to evidence that you need the grant, and there will be some kind of outputs that are required, which might be jobs or some kind of carbon energy reduction or social economic impact. And again, what the expectations are, or the outputs as they're known, will be made clear in the details of the grant itself. So let's jump on to what are the pros of grants funding. Well, the good news is grants are not repayable, so they are the best kind of finance. They can make projects which are otherwise uneconomical viable for the purpose, particularly during the early stages of you trying a new product or service. A grant can be an essential contribution. There are business organisations particularly good at being able to give you guidance and advice on local grants. Most notably, the growth hubs in each area are pretty good. I mean, at all grants, but definitely very good in terms of being able to point you in the direction of suitable suitable local grant schemes. And there is an irony in all of this, in that once you've been awarded a grant, believe it or not, you are actually more likely to secure further grant support later on, because once you've proven that you can navigate through the grant process, you become a more trusted provider of management of grant programs. The cons of grant funding, well, it can be time consuming. Certainly the application process is fiddly. There can be quite a lot of form filling to be done. As previously noted, most grants will have an intervention rate, and that means that another way of looking at that is they call upon the requirement for there to be matched funding, as it's known. So in the example I previously mentioned, a £50,000 project, you're applying for a grant. The maximum the grant's going to be in most instances is 50% of that, and you'll need to be able to prove that you have the 25%, the 25,000 match funding to be able to progress through to the grant itself. I've talked about relative merit, so I won't linger on that, but it can be hard to get hold of, and there'll be lots of other businesses that are submitting applications. Most grant programs are massively oversubscribed, and it's not uncommon for them to be 6, 7, 8 or even 10 times oversubscribed for the amount of money available on the grant. There'll be strings attached, there'll be some kind of output requirements, not uncommonly jobs, and there's an element of irony in that, because very often grants are trying to help businesses to become more productive, and we all know that the parlance of being more productive in itself is very often a kind of a use of words that describe having less jobs required to do the same level of output. So there is a kind of twist in that tale, but nonetheless you'll see what the output requirements are on the grant scheme itself, and you need to be sure you can meet those to avoid any risk of clawback. Again, I mentioned earlier that there's a requirement in most grant applications to be able to show that you need the money. In fact, the question will very often be asked, what would happen if you didn't have the grant? Would the project go ahead? And clearly that question is designed to solicit the response that the project couldn't possibly go ahead without the grant funding. So having convinced the grant assessors that your business needs the grant and wants the grant to be able to go forward with the project, you'll then find that many grant schemes call upon you to incur the entire cost of the project before you claim back the grant contribution. And trust me, the irony of that is definitely not lost on me. Incidentally, and we'll talk about this a bit further on, if there is an issue there, genuinely you do need external funding to bridge the gap so you can spend the money. You're buying a piece of plant, it's a £50,000 piece of plant, you're called upon to contribute the 25k under the intervention rate. You've convinced the grant awarding panel with some justification that you don't have that 25k to be able to put in, and then you find that the grant scheme calls upon you to spend the 50 in order to claim back the 25. If that does become a problem to you, let us know, and we may be able to secure you some bridge funding to be able to deal with that immediate short-term cash issue. So grants are a short-term alternative, and you do need to think about, well, okay, I bought the piece of machinery, I need to be able to manage it and operate it and have the staff around for the long term to make use of it. So how to assess if it's the right option for you? Well, I can't overstate this enough, and in fact I will end up, forgive me, but repeating it. But there is a requirement for you to make sure that the eligibility of the grant scheme applies to your project. And I just kind of pause there for a moment. What I'm saying there is you need to focus on what are the calls for the grant scheme. Make sure you understand what they're trying to achieve with the grant scheme and that your project meets that requirement, not the other way around. Clearly there'll be a submission deadline. Make sure that you've left yourself enough time. Check to make sure that you've got the match funding if that when that's called for. Carefully consider whether the aims of the grant scheme align with your project, going back to that earlier point. Consider what the outcomes are. Can you deliver them? Because there's no point in promising outputs and then falling short. Most grant schemes will call upon you to follow up, or there'll be a follow-up to make sure that if you've promised to create 6 jobs over the next 12 or 18 months, there will be a reporting requirement to confirm that that's actually happened. And there is a risk, by the way, of there being a clawback if you don't deliver on an output target that you've promised in the application. Make sure you know what the timeframes are. This is a very important point because expenditure on a grant, on a project that precedes the approval of the grant, it almost certainly will not qualify as expenditure for the project. So if there's a requirement for there to be a deposit, or you're building a new building and you're anxious to get the foundations laid, just be mindful of the fact that expenditure that gets incurred before the grant is signed off will almost always not qualify for the grant itself. So you'll have disqualified yourself from getting that included in the costs of the grant. And again, just this subtle point, but you do need to be aware of whether or not you're going to need to outlay the expenditure and then claim it back, or whether or not the grant contribution can be called down. Now, a lot of grants, particularly the bigger ones, will allow some phasing in terms of the expenditure, so it won't necessarily be the requirement that you find the entire match for the project. It may well be that you can call part of the grant as different phases of the expenditure occurred, but a smaller grant will typically require you spend the money first and then claim the grant back when you can evidence that you've spent it. Useful tips on how to best source the right type of grant funding. Again, eligibility. Make sure that your project meets the eligibility requirement. Sometimes a grant will have an expression of interest phase. We certainly use that when we manage the Stoke and Staffs programme. And if there is an expression of interest, it's usually a much simpler form. It allows you to engage with the grant awarding body and have an opportunity to engage with them, interface with them, to make sure that you've had a discussion about the applicability of the project. So if there is an EOI stage, it won't prevent you from simply making a full application at the subsequent stage. But if there is an EOI stage, use it, is my recommendation to you. And don't be afraid to contact the grant awarding bodies. There seems to be a general reluctance. We seem to want to work in silos. Don't be like that. If there's a grant awarding body and their contact details are there, ring them up, talk to them about your project, explain what you're thinking of doing, get their views as to whether or not it meets the general requirements of the project itself. Can be useful to look at other projects. When we talk here about research of what types of projects and businesses have been supported, again, the way the grant awarding bodies typically work is that as soon as they start to roll out the grant programme, they will be anxious. I know, again, in the case of the one we ran, they'll be anxious to get case studies published showing some of the projects they've supported, and that serves the purpose of both helping to guide, promoting the programme, but also helping to guide would-be applicants as the kind of projects that are getting funded. So if those are around, pay attention to them, take a look at them, see if they help you, with the objectives of your project. Think about the project itself, and again, make sure that your intentions for your project align with the intentions of the grant. You've got a much better chance of securing the grant if those things are true. If a budget is needed to be prepared, make sure it's not terribly complicated, it's clear and easy to read. And a bit of a bugbear of mine is make sure it's print formatted. That simply means formatting the spreadsheet so that if somebody presses the print button, it doesn't spit out 200 blank pages. So it's a relatively easy process to do, and it will just make the grant assessment process a lot easier. And even if your grant initial applications decline. Most grant programs have more than one call. Don't necessarily be discouraged. Talk to the grant assessors, try and find out why you were declined. And if it is possible to incorporate their feedback, most schemes will permit more than one application. It's quite rare for a grant scheme to forbid a subsequent application, even to the same scheme. And you'll be surprised what you learn from the feedback. To increase your chances, the do's and don'ts, don't wait to the last minute. I'm the world's worst at this, so don't do as I do here rather than as I say. I mean, I think you'd be surprised how long these things take, and therefore don't leave yourself short of time in writing the grant bid application. I mean, it goes without saying, think your project thoroughly through, but in quite a level of detail. In other words, try and avoid, if you can, using estimates in your budget application. The grant needs to be focused on the call of the grant program, not necessarily your business, if you like. So yes, they're interested in what your business is trying to achieve, but they're much more interested in what it is about the project that you have in mind that meets the grant requirement. As previously mentioned, don't be afraid to call the grant people and talk to them about what you're planning. Don't overstate or estimate your budget. Try where possible to be as accurate and as precise as you can. If there are multiple quote rules, then observe them. You will simply be disqualified, and you'll make the job of the assessors easier than you want to make it, that if you don't follow the rules. By the way, that's also true of things like word limits. It's true of document limits and attaching lots of documents to your grant application. You need to try and apply the rules of the grant. Let me explain again why that matters, because when you're faced as an assessor, as we were, with an interest level that was 4 times the amount, or a bit more actually than 4 times the amount of the grant we got. Actually, those applicants that had ignored rules, had not done multiple quotes, were ignoring word limits or attaching documents that weren't called for, made life a little easier for us, because brutally put, they were easy to filter out and say, well, this didn't meet the grant requirements, therefore we're not even going to spend hours assessing this project versus that of another. So don't make life easy for them. Make life hard. Make sure that you get through to the appraisal stage. So don't overthrow documents. Make your documents easy and concise and easy to read where possible. And generally speaking, observe the rules where at all possible. Incidentally, on the word limit rules, we didn't do it on ours, but it's not uncommon for them to, if they apply a word limit, they can actually suck information out of the grant applications to show the assessors side by side. If they've said on a particular section of a grant application, do not exceed 250 words, you may be unaware of this, but actually when they do take that information out of the grant application to put in front of the grant assessors, they may only take the first 250 words out of that section and present it before the grant assessors. So you may be completely unaware of this, but they're only reading the first 250. If you've written 500 words, 250 of them never even made it to the eyeballs of the assessors. So that's kind of me done in terms of the general principles of grants and how to best improve your chances. I said at the top that we would talk briefly at the end about the Jerome's grant service, which we're launching today, and to do that I'm going to hand over to my colleague Ross Davies, who's going to manage that within the Jerome's corporate finance team. So Ross, do you want to just jump in now and talk people through the Jerome's grant service that we're starting today?
Yep. Good morning, everyone. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the grant service we're launching today. So the first thing is that we're going to be putting out a regular newsletter with updates on new and available grants. The first of which should be going out this afternoon. Will feature information on several new grant schemes. One of which, for example, will be the local restriction support grant, which is for businesses that have been forced to close due to local lockdown restrictions. And through that grant scheme, you could be eligible for up to £1,500 for every 3-week period you've been closed, although that is dependent on your rateable value. The grants will be issued by local councils. As this has only recently been announced, we're still waiting further details on the application process. We will also offer guidance, hints and tips on new grants. So if you have any questions about any new grants, please feel free to get in touch with whoever is your contact at Jerem's, and they'll pass it on to one of the team, and we'll deal with it. We'll also be offering a grant finder. So if you have a project you think might be suitable for grant funding, please do get in touch again with your contact at Jerem's. We'll pass on your inquiry to us, and we'll pick it up with you and see whether there's any sort of suitable grant funding out there for your project. We also have a dedicated area within the Jerem's corporate finance website. On it will be listed grant schemes and information about the grant schemes, which will be updated on a regular basis to reflect any new grant schemes. We could also assist with match funding, as Paul touched on earlier. As Jerem's corporate finance, we do a lot of fundraising for businesses, so I'm more than happy to have a discussion with you if you're struggling to find the match element of the grant funding, or whether you need to outlay a bit of expenditure before you can claim back the grant. We'll also do an honest appraisal of the merits of your project. So we'll have a discussion with you and maybe even review your application before you submit it to assess the likelihood of you getting the grant for the project, or we might even suggest edits to further help your application. Assistance if needed. So this can be something like we can help with writing the grant applications, or we could help with preparing the budgets and the financial forecasts as well. I'm just going to hand back over to my colleague Paul now for the question and answers.
All right, so thanks everybody, and again, a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but hopefully gave you a flavour of some of the idiosyncrasies of the world of grants. It was a super quick process. I know there's a lot of content there, so I think Sharon's planning to share the presentation separately once the webinar is complete. But in the meantime, I'm hoping that some of you will have some questions. They may have been posted up, and Sharon can let me know what they are, and we'll do our best to address them. Sharon?
Okay, well, I've looked through the questions. Most of them actually we have covered in the presentation. There is just the one actually where somebody's asked, can asset finance be a match against grant funding?
It's a good question, and a logical question. So to articulate those to everybody that's on the webinar, what that question means is that let's assume that the grant is a capital project. There's a piece of plant and machinery that you're thinking of buying. You've got an offer from a finance company. They're prepared to provide you with finance of maybe, I don't know, 50% of that, and you're looking for a grant for the balance of the 50%. Now, ironically, and for reasons that I've never fully understood, is that asset finance is almost always not permissible as something that can be used as a match against grant funding. I think it's to do with the ownership status of the asset, because in the case of most asset financing, the reason why we're using asset finance is that we're actually pledging the ownership of the equipment until the asset is fully paid up to the finance company. But it is generally not permissible. But again, if that proves to be an issue to you, or you come across that issue, it is one we can potentially bridge. So we can maybe secure the finance you need in order to qualify for the grant, and that wouldn't prevent you necessarily, once the asset's on board and the grant's been awarded and you're now the owner of the business, of going back and looking at the opportunity to do a kind of sale and lease back of the asset itself. That wouldn't technically be contrary to the rules of the grant scheme, but I would suggest you approach the issue of asset finance with some caution, because it can be one that is very often not permissible by the way the rules are written. Sharon, any others?
Yeah, a couple more. I work in music where grants are really important. Often we use specialist grant writers to actually fill in the applications. Is this a service you offer, and how would you charge for a service like this?
Yeah, it is a service we offer. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that we're experts in the music industry, so I think you should judge the support, if you're going to procure that support, based upon the expertise of the organisation that's providing it. But it's a common service that's provided. We do, as part of the service that Ross just outlined, we will provide. To answer the question as to how that's charged, it's effectively done on the basis of, we'll make an assessment of the of the workload that's going to be required and make a charge for that as we provide that service, if you like. So it's what I would call a time-related fee service that's provided. So yes, it is something we do. And in terms of choosing your partner on bid writing as opposed to financial modelling, I mean, that may sound like an unimportant distinction, but you know, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think generally speaking, accountants, your accountants are in a good place to assist you with the budgeting. In terms of bid writing, I think I'd err in favour of you making sure that the credentials of who assist you with the bid writing phase have experience in your sector and in the particular grant scheme that you're applying for. But the answer is yes, we do it for sure, yeah, and we'd be happy to see if we can assist. Sharon?
That pretty much concludes it, actually.
All right, cool, brilliant. Appreciate everybody for jumping on the webinar this morning. I hope it was informative, and as Sharon said at the top of the agenda, we'll circulate the details of the presentation, and needless to say, we'll be only too delighted to provide any feedback or follow up if anybody's got any questions. But thanks everybody, stay safe, and hopefully see you all on the next webinar.